SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 20. A Friendly Exchange. The revealing of the Secret Santas was in full swing with the traditional amount of noise and craziness that was found in the 8th year's common room every Saturday night. They had started out with a ridiculous game where everyone took turns trying to open a wrapped gift with oven mitts on their hands. Daphne had run, gleefully shrieking, around the room, waving a fistful of curly-whirly and flake bars over her head, as Dean chased her, yelling that he had gotten the last bit of paper off, and the fact that she had just taken the lid off the box did not make those hers. Draco had just handed Neville his gift, a brand new set of gardening hand tools, including a trowel, and a pair of dragonhide gloves. The former Gryffindor was beside himself, beet red in the face, mouth gaping like a goldfish. He stood and looked at his former nemesis straight in the eye. "Thanks, Malfoy," he said sincerely, and flung his arms around Draco in a bear hug. Draco, whose arms were pinned down by his sides, awkwardly patted Neville's elbows and muttered, "Welcome," while blushing furiously. Hermione thought it was one of the best moments of the night. Luna presented Dean with a new pair of Quidditch gloves, which now made his clues of twigs to represent a broom, a gold feather, snitch wings, a red bouncy ball, the quaffle, and a hula hoop, goalpost, to make a little more sense. "But Luna," questioned Dean, after thanking her with a hug and a wide grin, "what's with the roast chicken leg you left me yesterday?" "Well," she replied dreamily, "you need to keep up your strength. You can't play on an empty stomach, can you?" This sent everyone into peals of laughter, especially since Dean had been rather afraid to approach his stocking yesterday as the juicy chicken had been leaking through the fuzz, dripping onto the hearth. When the laughter died down, Hermione looked up to find Theo standing in front of her with a sheepish smile on his face. He held out a package wrapped in gold paper and tied with a sparkly red ribbon. "Happy Christmas, Granger." "I knew it was you," she exclaimed, jumping up to her feet. "Our first conversation about books, back at the beginning of term, although you threw me off with a couple of your clues." She narrowed her eyes at him. "Yeah, well, didn't want to be too obvious," he drawled on. "Go on." He gestured to the gift he was holding. She immediately unwrapped it, and when she saw what it was, her eyes went very wide, and her mouth opened in a perfect O. She gazed up at him in disbelief. "Theo," she breathed, "I can't accept this. There's no way you stuck to the price limit." In her hand, she held a first edition copy of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. While it was very old, it was still in pristine condition. The front cover was pale blue, with the title etched in gold script. The spine was decorated with an intricate pattern of gold and pink lines, crisscrossing over a background of darker blue. It was beautiful. "Well," Theo looked a little abashed, "I didn't actually pay anything for it. This copy belonged to my grandmother, and she left all of her books to me when she died." He looked into her shining brown eyes. "It's all right, yeah?" Hermione flung her arms around his neck with an exuberant, "Yes, thank you." She kissed his cheek with a loud "mwah," and, still beaming, turned to place the book on her seat. She didn't notice the scowl that had crossed Draco's face during their exchange, but Theo did. He raised his eyebrows at his friend, but Draco just looked away. The gift exchanging continued, with Daphne giving Theo a brand new chess set, which he already had received 3 pieces from during the week, as well as a timer and a small book about the history of the game, which had left him slightly speechless and a little emotional. He had given his fellow former Slytherin a long hug, ending with a wide smile on both of their faces. Daphne received a sketchbook and a set of colorful inks from Padma, who she had once told about her secret ambition to be a fashion designer. Padma had given her fabric, thread, ribbons, and fashion magazines throughout the week, which the beautiful girl had raved over. Neville had been Hannah's Secret Santa, and had focused her on her fondness for polka dots. The hair scarf on the first day had been followed by socks, stationery, a small pouch for carrying things, and a mug. He now handed her a small potted plant, the bright green leaves with several delicate purple buds starting to appear. "When they bloom, the petals will have yellow dots on them," he explained shyly. Hannah had given him a hug and a very gentle kiss on his cheek that left both of them blushing pink as they sat back down next to each other. "This is for you, Luna," Hannah said, waving her wand as a small golden bird cage floated across the common room from the direction of Hannah's chambers. The cage settled itself gently on the floor in front of Luna, who gasped in amazement at the 3 tiny creatures hovering inside. "Billywigs!" she exclaimed, holding the cage up so everyone could see the bright blue insects, as the propeller-like wings atop their heads whirred incessantly. Each was roughly the size of a large marble, and they seemed to emit a tiny buzzing sound. Everyone knew Luna's love for magical creatures, especially the unusual ones, which Hannah had capitalized on with her clues. The butterbeer corks to ward off nargles, a new pair of dirigible plum earrings, a painting of a freshwater plimpy, a recent article about crumplehorn snorkax, and a pair of socks with fairies knitted on them. While everyone was still admiring the billywigs, Dean jumped up and ran to one of the round tables, picked up a small, square box, and handed it to Anthony. All week, Anthony had been working on puzzles left in his stocking, a page of ancient runes, a riddle that, when solved, would make something appear, which turned out to be his favorite biscuits, an anagram challenge, a set of silver rings he was supposed to be able to separate but hadn't yet been able to, and a small jigsaw puzzle that created a picture of Snape in a shower cap. The last one had caused much snorting of pumpkin juice over breakfast that morning when Anthony had displayed the finished product. As he began unwrapping the green paper, Dean excitedly explained that it was a Muggle puzzle. "Rubik's Cube," Anthony read off the object in his hand. "Yeah," continued Dean, "you have to make all the sides solid colors." And he proceeded to help get the cube out of the box, showing Anthony, who was completely enthralled with his gift, how to rotate the sides and was giving him tips. Several others had gathered around, having never seen one before. "Wait!" hollered Padma, and everyone turned to see an exasperated look on her face. "Some of us still don't know who our secret Santa is." As she said this, Hermione realized that only Padma and Draco were left. Everyone knew Padma wasn't Draco's, so surely he must be figuring this out. Her hands started to sweat, and she began to second-guess her whole gift idea, panicking over whether or not he would like it and bemoaning the fact that it was too late now. While Hermione was internally wailing, Draco was thinking very fast. Padma had been Daphne's Santa, so she wasn't his, which meant it was Granger. He wanted to cheer. He wanted to throw up. He threw a quick glance in her direction and noticed that even though she was seemingly focused on Padma, her leg was bouncing and she was chewing her bottom lip. Sure signs that she was nervous. That made him feel a tiny bit better. But why would she be nervous? Her clues had been brilliant. Surely she wasn't nervous about giving him gifts. Before he could ponder that further, Anthony paused his Rubik's Cube tutorial from Dean and presented Padma with a shiny silver gift bag, stuffed with the red and green tissue papers. She fluttered her fingers excitedly and took it from him, peeking inside at once. "Ooh," she breathed, pulling out a leather-bound journal and 3 gorgeous quills that clearly came from exotic birds. Padma loved to write, especially poetry, which apparently Anthony knew about his fellow former Ravenclaw. Her clues had indicated several well-known poems, a set of colorful inks, a silk bookmark patterned with flowers, and the first quill she'd received on Monday. "Thank you so much, Anthony." She gave him a glowing smile and hugged the journal to herself. "That just leaves you, Draco," hollered Dean. Hermione took a deep breath and walked over to the Christmas tree in the corner. Going around towards the back, she came out with a medium-sized cauldron in her hands, filled with green tissue paper, a wide, red ribbon tied around the middle. She stopped straight in front of Draco, who was still sitting on the couch, and placed the cauldron in his lap. She looked up at her quizzically, and she shrugged, still chewing her lip. "Did you figure out what the potion is supposed to be?" she asked him. "I think so," he began, "but I think I'm still missing an ingredient." He asked the last part as a question, raising his eyebrows at her. She nodded and looked poignantly at the cauldron. He reached in and felt a small glass bottle under the tissue. Pulling it out, he recognized it as a squillbub, he said thoughtfully. His brows knitted together and his mind raced. Going over the list of ingredients, it dawned on him. "Felix Felicis?" he asked, meeting her eyes. She nodded, watching for his reaction. A wide grin broke out on his face. "This is brilliant, Granger," he stated sincerely. "Do you really like it?" she asked. "Absolutely," he said, nodding vigorously, looking at the bottle. "This is one of the trickiest potions to make, and I've never even tried it before. Always wanted to, though." He glanced back up at her and saw she still looked uneasy. "There's one more thing in there," she mumbled, wringing her hands. He reached into the cauldron again and felt some sort of jar in there. Pulling it out, he burst into laughter, startling his housemates, but allowing Hermione to huff out a sigh in relief. "What's so funny?" asked Neville. Draco showed them all what he was holding. It was a very large jar of Nutella, topped with a bright red stick-on bow. Confusion crossed the faces of several housemates, so Dean launched into an explanation of the sweet, spreadable treat. Draco's shoulders shook with laughter as he stood to thank Hermione. He met her eyes, which were trained on his own with sparkling anticipation, and lifted his arms slightly as if moving to embrace her. Without a second thought, she stepped forward and wrapped her own arms around his waist. For a moment, time stood still for the unlikely pair. She leaned her cheek against his chest and could hear his heartbeat thrumming a little faster than normal. His arms tightened slightly around her, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in her fragrant curls. Hermione was just thinking how nice it all was, when she remembered they weren't alone, even though the room had gone suspiciously silent. They broke apart to find 8 pairs of eyes staring at them, some in surprise, some in confusion, and one in what looked like a mischievous triumph. Those were Theo's, and were accompanied by an all-too-knowing smirk. Slightly embarrassed, both Hermione and Draco cleared their throats and looked everywhere around the room but at each other. They started speaking at the same time, with Draco mumbling a soft, "Thanks, Granger," and Hermione squeaking out, "Happy Christmas, Malfoy," while their friends continued to watch with increasing amusement. Thankfully, at that very moment, the door to the room swung open, and both Bill Weasley and Professor McGonagall strode in. "Greetings, you lot," drawled Bill good-naturedly as he approached the group. The headmistress gave them all a curt nod, but seemed to be at a loss for words as she surveyed the disaster in front of her. Festive music was blaring in the background. Wads of wrapping paper, sheets of tissue, bows, and ribbons littered the floor. A knocked-over bowl of popcorn, random couch cushions, sweets wrappers, and pumpkin juice bottles added to the disarray. The students were draped across the couches, chairs, and floor in a haphazard way, and presents were still being passed around and admired, including Luna's new pets, which had started to buzz louder as the noise level had increased. "We were just finishing up our gift exchange, Professor," Hermione began. "Yeah, we did a Secret Santa all week," started Dean, but he stopped when McGonagall's beady eyes landed on him. "Secret Santas?" she demanded. Everyone started talking at once, trying to explain while also trying to avoid getting in trouble. They hadn't done anything wrong, although several of them had snuck out to Hogsmeade to get their gifts during the week, and they hadn't broken any rules, aside from the fact that it was definitely almost curfew now, and they were clearly still throwing a party. Bill seemed to be fighting the urge to laugh, while McGonagall listened intently to Dean, Hannah, and Daphne's explanations. As this distraction took place, Hermione and Padma surreptitiously waved their wands and vanished a majority of the trash. The rest quietly straightened the cushions and organized the gifts in a much neater array on the coffee table. By the time everything had been set to rights, McGonagall seemed much less severe and followed Daphne over to the coffee table to examine everyone's presents. All the students sat down again, with Theo gallantly pulling one of the armchairs over for the headmistress to sit in. Once she did, they took turns showing their gifts and telling her about the clues that they had received and who their Secret Santa had turned out to be. When Draco showed the jar of Nutella, he had to explain a portion of that day in Hermione's kitchen. As he was speaking, Hermione noticed understanding dawn on the faces of several of her housemates, and both Neville and Luna smiled at her. Professor McGonagall herself looked quite pleased at the end, and told them all how very glad she was to see how well they were getting on with each other. "As you know," she began crisply, standing up and straightening her robes, "tomorrow begins the Christmas holiday. Each of you have been appointed a time to come to my office and use the flue to travel to your holiday destination." She waved her wand, and a scroll unfurled next to her with everyone's names listed and their assigned time slot. She plucked the parchment from the air and handed it to Anthony, who was sitting closest to her. "Please let me know if you have a conflict with your flue time. Otherwise, I shall see you off tomorrow. Good night." With that, she swept from the room. Bill was still there, having joined Dean and Padma on the couch, and asked what everyone's plans were for the next few weeks. As conversation flowed, Hermione found herself struggling to keep her eyes open. She leaned forward to look at the list McGonagall had left and saw that her flue appointment time was set for 10:30 in the morning. Still having things to pack and organize, she decided to call it a night. She stood up and stretched and announced her intentions to the group at large. "Thank you for such a fun week and a wonderful party." She smiled warmly at each of her housemates. Her gaze lingered just a second longer on the pale blonde across from her. "See you at the Burrow on Christmas?" asked Bill. "Of course," she replied happily, picking up her book from Theo and waving to everyone as she strolled off towards the room. Once the party had broken up, Draco had gone back to his room to finish packing. He was carefully placing all of his new ingredients into the cauldron when there was a small knock on his door. He opened it to find Theo leaning casually against the doorframe. "So?" smirked Theo. "So what?" asked Draco, resuming his packing. "How long?" "How long what?" "Come off it, mate," chuckled Theo. "How long were you going to wait to tell me about Granger?" Draco's head snapped up. "There's nothing to tell," he said stiffly. "Right," said Theo, moving into the room and flopping onto Draco's bed. So the way she's always staring at you, the fact that she goes out of her way to sit near you, the elaborate Secret Santa clues she's put together, which were right up your alley, mind you, and most importantly, the hug she gave you today that left her blushing like a strawberry. You're telling me that's all nothing." Draco had stopped in place as he listened to Theo tick off the observations. Were they true? He shook his head. "We're just friends." He started to object, but Theo gave a giant snort and sat up, fixing Draco with a penetrating stare. "You can tell yourself that all you want, but you've been moony-eyed over her all term, and I reckon she feels the same." "I have not," Draco spluttered, completely thrown off his guard. Theo snorted again. "Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that the stalker-like way you watch her, or the beeline you make to sit across from her at every meal, or the way you sniff the air when she walks by was all just part of this newly formed friendship." Draco went slack-jawed, gaping at his friend, who rolled his eyes and stood up. "I know you don't like to talk about the last few years," Theo began in a more serious tone, and Draco stiffened in response, clenching his jaw. "But you've changed, and she seems to know that. What's more, she seems to be totally willing to leave the past exactly where it belongs. Let her." He moved towards the door, turning one more time to his friend, who seemed frozen on the spot. "I think you'd be brilliant together for what it's worth." He smirked again and left, closing the door behind him. Draco stood there for a few more minutes, contemplating Theo's advice. It really did boil down to just that, leaving the past behind him. He had successfully, or at least he felt it to be so, turned his back on the prejudiced pureblood notions that had formerly ruled him. He had made a genuine effort all term to get to know each of his housemates, regardless of previous animosity, and had been greatly rewarded when they had reciprocated the effort in turn. He knew he wasn't nearly as arrogant and surly as he had been before, and the 9 other people he shared the room with seemed to accept him for who he was becoming, and believed in his desire to change. All of this was true, he realized with heavy humility, but he had still held on to the idea that he wasn't good enough, hadn't proven himself enough. He realized with stark clarity that he was the only thing holding himself back. "All right, then," he muttered to himself, quickly finishing with the cauldron and reaching into his nightstand drawer. Removing a small package, he exited his room and strode across to the other side of the now empty common area. Hermione opened the door after the second knock and was completely surprised to see Draco standing there. She'd already changed for bed, and knew she probably looked a mess, with her hair piled up in a loose bun on top of her head, and her baggy sweatshirt almost covering her knit shorts. "Malfoy?" She studied his face curiously. He looked nervous and wouldn't meet her eyes. I have something for you." He stumbled over his words in a rush to get them out and thrust the gift towards her. Her eyes widened as she looked at it, glancing at his face again before taking it. "It's nothing, really," he rushed on. "Just something, small well." But by then, Hermione had unwrapped it, and a glowing smile had made its way across her face. In her hand was a silver picture frame. Instead of a photograph, however, there was a drawing of some sort, on a white piece of paper, the lines and doodles wiggling slightly as she watched. "This was from the Pictionary game, wasn't it?" she asked him, amazed. "Yeah, it was the last one. The one we won the game with." He smiled shyly. "Gamp's Law of Elemental Transfiguration," they said together, and both chuckled. "I rescued it before it got tossed in the fire with the rest, and I shrunk it down to fit the frame," he explained unnecessarily. She looked up at him with shining eyes and the prettiest smile he thought he'd ever seen, causing his heart to thunder like a herd of hippogriffs. "I just thought it was a nice way to remember the first game night, and all the craziness, and Longbottom's Thestral, and Knott's airplane, and—" He trailed off, looking at the floor, unable to think of any more words that would make sense of the moment. "It's worth 1,000 words," she said softly, taking a step towards him so he was looking directly down at her, into her warm, chocolate-brown eyes. She still held the frame in one hand, but she reached her other hand up and placed it on his chest, over his heart, which now felt like it was climbing into his throat. She gazed into his eyes for a second longer before closing her own, rising on tiptoes and pressing a soft, sweet kiss on his lips. He stopped breathing. He was pretty sure his heart stopped beating, and then it was pounding and roaring in his ears when, much too soon, she pulled away, and she was still smiling at him and hadn't moved her hand off his chest. He swallowed with difficulty and covered it with his own, allowing himself to memorize her face, the freckles splashed across the bridge of her nose, the slight pink tinge on her cheeks, the cupid's bow of her upper lip. His gaze roved over her features, finding their way back to the long lashes that fringed her sparkling eyes, and he felt himself smiling back. Not wanting to end this perfect moment, but knowing he didn't want to say something stupid and screw it all up, he decided to play it safe. "My flu appointment is at 11 o'clock tomorrow. When's yours?" he asked her, still holding onto her hand. 10:30, she replied, her eyes never leaving his face. "So, breakfast tomorrow, before you go?" He asked this, realizing how mundane it sounded since everyone would be eating breakfast, but he hoped she understood what he meant. "Yeah," she breathed. "Breakfast." He squeezed her hand gently, lowering it to her side and taking a step back over the threshold of her room, and said, "Well then, good night, Granger," with a soft smirk, quietly shutting the door behind him. He wanted to do cartwheels across the room. He wanted to sprint through the halls or yell from the top of the Quidditch stands. Instead, he settled for barging into Theo's room with a ridiculous grin on his face and announcing, "Happy Christmas, Not!" in a very loud voice before sweeping back out the door and allowing it to bang shut behind him. Theo, who had been reading in his bed, just smirked and shook his head, pretty sure he knew exactly what that had been about. Meanwhile, Hermione hadn't moved. She had closed her eyes again after Draco shut her door, allowing her mind to replay the last few minutes. A very small part of her was mildly mortified by the fact that she had made the first move. She never did things like that. But the rest of her was floating on a cloud. She had to believe he felt something for her after that. The hug earlier today had made her hopeful, but this, the way he had looked at her and studied her face, the way he had held onto her hand, the picture he'd saved for her, these might be small gestures in a grand scheme of the world, but when it came to Draco Malfoy, she knew just how huge it all really was, and it was more than enough for her.